Good evening, folks, wherever you're listening from tonight. Maybe you're driving a long stretch of highway somewhere in the middle of nowhere. Maybe you're sitting in a quiet truck stop with a cup of cheap coffee. Or maybe you're lying in bed right now, telling yourself you should probably be asleep. But instead you're here, listening to strange stories from across the country. And if that's you, well, you're not alone. Tonight's story is one that reportedly came from a small town tucked near the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia. Locals still talk about it from time to time, usually late at night when the roads are empty and the forest feels just a little too quiet. Some people say it's just a story. Others swear it really happened. The story is about a man named Ethan Walker. Ethan was 32 years old and lived in a small working town not far from the Appalachian Range. He worked construction, the kind of job that started before sunrise and often didn't end until the sky was already dark. He was known as a hard worker, reliable, determined. But Ethan had a habit that many people share without realizing it. He was always chasing the future. Overtime shifts, weekend jobs, extra projects. Money first, everything else later. His mother called him almost every week, but Ethan rarely answered. His younger sister invited him to dinner more times than he could remember, yet he always said the same thing. Maybe next week, I'm busy right now. The truth was, Ethan believed he had plenty of time. Time to visit family. Time to slow down. One Friday evening, after an exhausting week of work, Ethan decided to take 2 days off and go camping alone in the Appalachian Mountains. He thought it would just be a quiet weekend. But sometimes, 2 days can change an entire life. The next morning, Ethan packed his truck before the sun had fully risen above the hills. A thin layer of fog rested over the small town, the kind of quiet Appalachian morning where the streets were nearly empty and only a few diners had their lights on. Before heading toward the mountains, Ethan stopped at a small outdoor supply shop on the edge of town. The place was old. Wooden walls, dusty shelves, and a faded sign hanging above the door that read, Holloway's General Supply. A small bell rang as Ethan pushed the door open. Behind the counter stood an elderly man with gray hair and a thick flannel shirt. His name was Mr. Holloway, the owner of the shop. Most people in town knew him. He had been running the place for longer than anyone could remember. Mr. Holloway looked up from a newspaper. "Morning," he said calmly. "Morning," Ethan replied, "just grabbing a few things for a quick camping trip." The old man nodded slowly. "Where are you heading?" "Appalachian Trail area, just 2 days. Needed a break from work." For a moment the old man said nothing. His eyes rested on Ethan a little longer than expected. "Camping alone?" he finally asked. "Yeah, why not?" Mr. Holloway folded his newspaper and leaned slightly against the counter. "You can camp out there," he said quietly. "Just don't wander too deep into the forest. Stick to the marked trails." Ethan chuckled. "I've been hiking since I was a kid. I'll be fine." But the old man didn't smile. "There are places in those mountains," Mr. Holloway continued slowly, "where things don't behave the way you expect." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The old man's voice lowered slightly. "Places where time doesn't move the same way it does here." Ethan laughed softly and shook his head. "Sounds like one of those old mountain stories." "Maybe," the old man replied. Ethan paid for his supplies, grabbed his bag, and headed for the door. As the bell rang again and the door closed behind him, Mr. Holloway stepped toward the window and watched Ethan drive away. The old man's expression was quiet, concerned. Because deep down, he knew something about those mountains that Ethan did not. By late afternoon, Ethan's truck was climbing the narrow road that wound through the Appalachian Mountains. Tall trees surrounded the road on both sides, their branches forming a thick canopy that filtered the fading sunlight. The deeper he drove, the quieter the world became. Soon, the paved road turned into gravel, and after another mile, Ethan reached a small clearing often used by hikers and campers. A wooden trail sign stood near the entrance, weathered and slightly crooked. Ethan parked his truck, stepped out, and stretched his arms. The air felt cooler up here. Fresh. Clean. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt like he could finally breathe. He grabbed his backpack, a small tent, and walked a short distance into the forest until he found a good spot near a narrow stream. Water trickled quietly over smooth stones, creating a peaceful background sound. "This'll do," Ethan muttered. He set up his tent quickly. Years of outdoor trips had made the process easy. Soon a small campfire crackled beside him as the sky slowly turned orange and purple through the tall trees. For a while, everything felt calm. Ethan sat on a fallen log, eating a simple meal and watching the last light disappear behind the mountains. Then night arrived. In the Appalachian forest, night comes quickly. The shadows deepened between the trees, and the forest sounds began to change. Crickets chirped in the distance. The wind whispered softly through the leaves. At first, Ethan found the sounds relaxing. But as the hours passed, the darkness seemed thicker than usual. The fire burned low, and Ethan eventually crawled into his tent, zipping it shut before lying back in his sleeping bag. The forest continued its quiet chorus outside. For a while, Ethan slept peacefully. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, he woke up. At first he wasn't sure why. He lay still, staring at the ceiling of the tent. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Soft. Slow. Somewhere between the trees. Ethan held his breath. Crunch. Another step. It sounded like someone walking carefully through dry leaves just outside the campsite. Ethan slowly reached for his flashlight. "Hello?" he called out from inside the tent. The forest went silent. No footsteps. No movement. Only the distant sound of the stream. After a moment, Ethan unzipped the tent and stepped outside. He swept the flashlight beam across the trees. Nothing. Just tall trunks and darkness stretching into the forest. Ethan stood there for a few seconds, listening carefully. The night was quiet again. Too quiet. Finally, he shrugged and muttered to himself. Probably a deer. He returned to the tent and zipped it shut. But as Ethan drifted back to sleep, something else moved silently in the darkness. Hidden between the trees. Watching the campsite. Watching him. Morning arrived slowly in the Appalachian forest. A pale gray light filtered through the tall trees as mist drifted between the trunks like thin smoke. Ethan woke to the quiet sound of the stream and the distant call of birds somewhere high in the canopy. For a moment, everything felt peaceful again. The strange footsteps from the night before seemed less important now. In daylight, the forest looked normal, calm, beautiful. Ethan crawled out of the tent, stretched his stiff arms, and started a small fire to boil water for coffee. The warmth of the cup in his hands made the cold mountain air feel more comfortable. After breakfast, he packed a small day bag. The plan was simple. Explore for a few hours, take some photos, then head back to camp before evening. Ethan checked his compass, slung the bag over his shoulder, and began walking deeper into the forest. At first, he followed the main hiking trail. But after about 30 minutes, he noticed something unusual. A narrow path branched off from the main trail. It was barely visible, just a faint opening between bushes and trees. The ground looked undisturbed, as if very few people had walked there. Ethan paused. The safe choice would have been to stay on the marked trail. But curiosity has a powerful pull. Just a quick look, Ethan said to himself. He stepped onto the narrow path. The deeper he walked, the quieter the forest became. At first he still heard birds and insects. Then gradually, those sounds faded. The air felt cooler, strangely still. After nearly an hour of walking, the trees suddenly opened up. Ethan stepped into a small, hidden valley. The place felt different. It was too quiet. No birds, no wind. Even the leaves on the trees seemed frozen in place. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of stones. Large, rough stones arranged in a perfect ring. They looked ancient, worn down by centuries of rain and weather. Ethan slowly approached. He crouched beside one of the stones, running his hand over its rough surface. "This definitely wasn't made by hikers," he murmured. For a moment he considered turning back. But something about the place pulled at his curiosity. Almost without thinking, Ethan stepped inside the circle. The moment both of his feet crossed the stone boundary, something changed. The wind stopped. Not slowed. Stopped completely. The forest around him seemed to hold its breath. Ethan looked around, suddenly uneasy. The silence felt heavy, pressing. A strange pressure filled the air, as if the entire forest was watching him. Then Ethan noticed something even stranger. His compass. The needle spun slowly in circles, round and round. It refused to settle. Ethan frowned. "That's weird." He stepped backward, leaving the stone circle. The wind returned instantly. Leaves rustled again. Birds called somewhere in the distance. The forest was alive once more. Ethan stood there for a long moment, staring at the ancient stones. He felt an odd sensation he couldn't explain, as if he had just stepped across an invisible line, a line that humans were never meant to cross. Ethan stood quietly at the edge of the stone circle for several seconds, trying to shake off the strange feeling crawling along the back of his neck. The valley looked normal again. Birds were singing. Leaves moved gently in the wind. Yet something about the place still felt wrong. He looked once more at the spinning compass in his hand. The needle was still struggling to settle, twitching slightly before finally pointing north again. "That's enough exploring," Ethan muttered. He turned around and began walking back toward the path he believed he had taken earlier. At first everything seemed normal. The narrow trail led through thick trees and uneven ground, just as it had before. Ethan walked at a steady pace, occasionally glancing down at his compass and the position of the sun. But after nearly 30 minutes of walking, he began to feel uneasy. The forest didn't look familiar. The trees around him seemed denser. The ground sloped in directions he didn't remember. Ethan stopped and checked his compass again. North. Still pointing north. "That can't be right," he whispered. He turned around and tried another direction. Another 20 minutes passed. Still no sign of the main trail. The deeper he walked, the thicker the forest seemed to become. Branches hung lower. The sunlight barely reached the forest floor. Then the first thin strands of fog began to appear between the trees. At first it was barely noticeable. But as the afternoon slowly turned toward evening, the fog thickened. By the time the sun dipped behind the mountains, the forest was covered in a cold gray mist. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. He checked his watch. Almost sunset. He should have been back at his campsite hours ago. "All right," he said quietly to himself. "Just stay calm." He tried retracing his steps. But every direction looked the same. The forest had turned into a maze of identical trees and silent shadows. As darkness arrived, the fog grew even heavier. Soon, Ethan could barely see more than 20 feet ahead of him. He decided to stop moving. Wandering blindly through the mountains at night was a terrible idea. He found a small patch of ground between several trees and quickly set up his emergency lantern. The soft yellow light pushed back the darkness just enough to give him a small circle of safety. Ethan sat down on a fallen log, trying to steady his breathing. Just one night, he told himself. In the morning, I'll find the trail. For a while, the forest remained silent. Then Ethan saw something. Movement. Far away between the trees. He narrowed his eyes. A figure. Someone standing in the fog. Tall. Perfectly still. Ethan stood up quickly. "Hey!" he shouted. The figure did not respond. "Hello? Are you hiking out here?" No answer. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and started walking toward the shape. But as he moved closer, the fog shifted. The space between the trees was suddenly empty. No one was there. Ethan stopped walking. A cold chill ran through his chest. "Okay," he whispered nervously. "That's not funny." He turned around to head back toward his lantern, and froze. Another figure stood deeper in the forest. This one even farther away. Watching. Ethan shined his flashlight directly at it. The beam cut through the fog. The shape vanished instantly. His heart began to pound. He slowly walked back toward the lantern. Every sound in the forest now felt louder. Branches snapping in the distance. Leaves shifting under unseen footsteps. Several times Ethan thought he saw shapes moving between the trees. Tall. Human-like. But never close enough to see clearly. The hours dragged by painfully slow. The fog never lifted. And the forest never fully returned to silence. Sometimes Ethan heard quiet footsteps circling around the small ring of lantern light. Sometimes he thought he heard whispers carried by the wind, words he couldn't understand. Once, very clearly, he heard something behind him. A voice. Soft. Close. Wrong place. Ethan spun around instantly. Nothing stood there. Only the fog. Only the endless dark forest stretching in every direction. Ethan gripped his flashlight tightly. His hands trembled slightly. For the first time since entering the mountains, a terrible thought crossed his mind. Maybe Mr. Holloway had not been telling a story. Maybe there really were places in these mountains where humans did not belong. And maybe Ethan Walker had walked straight into one of them. The night dragged on longer than Ethan thought possible. The fog hung thick between the trees, swallowing the weak lantern light and turning the forest into a shifting wall of gray shadows. Ethan sat on the fallen log, barely moving, listening to every small sound around him. He had tried to convince himself that what he saw earlier was just his imagination. A trick of the fog. A trick of exhaustion. But deep down, something inside him knew the truth was not that simple. The forest felt aware. Time moved strangely. His watch ticked normally, yet the hours felt stretched, as if the night refused to end. At some point, Ethan noticed something new. Footsteps. Not the faint, distant sounds he had heard earlier. These were clear. Slow. Crunch. Crunch. Someone was walking through the leaves. The sound came from directly behind him. Ethan stood up quickly, gripping the flashlight. "Who's there?" he called. The footsteps stopped. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a voice spoke calmly from the darkness. "You should not be here tonight." The voice was old, deep, steady. Not threatening, but serious. Ethan slowly turned his flashlight toward the sound. The beam cut through the fog and landed on a figure standing several yards away. An old man. He wore a long, dark coat that looked worn from years of use. His gray beard reached down to his chest, and his face carried the quiet lines of someone who had spent a lifetime outdoors. He did not seem surprised to see Ethan. In fact, he looked almost expected. Ethan blinked in disbelief. "I didn't hear you walk up," Ethan said cautiously. The old man stepped a little closer into the lantern light. "You were not meant to," he replied. Ethan studied him carefully. "You camping out here?" Ethan asked. The old man shook his head slowly. "No." "Then what are you doing in the middle of the forest at night?" The old man looked around at the dark trees surrounding them. "I watch the forest." Ethan frowned. "What does that mean?" For a moment the old man did not answer. Instead, he studied Ethan with calm, thoughtful eyes. Finally, he asked a question of his own. "You stepped inside the stone circle today." Ethan felt a chill run through him. "How did you know that?" The old man ignored the question. That place is not meant for wandering travelers, he continued quietly. It belongs to something much older than the towns below these mountains. Ethan shifted uneasily. I didn't see any signs or warnings. There are warnings, the old man said softly. Just not the kind people like to read. The forest remained silent around them. The fog moved slowly through the trees like drifting smoke. Ethan crossed his arms, trying to stay calm. Look, he said, I just got lost. I'm trying to find my campsite and head back to town tomorrow. The old man nodded slightly. You will leave in the morning. That sounded reassuring. But something about the way the man said it made Ethan uneasy. What do you mean by that? Ethan asked. The old man stepped closer to the lantern light. For a moment, Ethan noticed something strange. The man's clothes looked very old. Not just worn. Old. Like something from decades ago. You crossed a boundary, the old man said calmly. There are places in this forest where the world bends in ways people do not understand. Ethan forced a small laugh. You mean like some kind of time warp? The old man's expression did not change. Time, he said slowly, is not as simple as humans believe. Ethan didn't respond. Part of him wanted to dismiss the conversation completely, but the events of the night had already shaken his confidence. The old man looked toward the foggy forest. You did not enter that place with bad intentions, he continued. That is why you are still here. Ethan swallowed. What happens to people who do? The old man did not answer right away. Instead, he looked back at Ethan with calm but heavy eyes. Some of them never find their way out. The wind rustled faintly through the trees. Ethan felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. So what happens now? He asked quietly. The old man pointed into the darkness behind Ethan. Walk east when the sun rises. You will find the road. Ethan nodded slowly. All right, thank you. The old man turned slightly, preparing to leave. But before disappearing into the fog, he stopped. There is something you should understand, he said. Ethan looked at him again. The old man's voice became even quieter. Where you step today, time does not always move the same way it does in the towns below these mountains. Ethan frowned. What does that mean? The old man looked at him for a long moment. Then he spoke the final words. When you return home, the world may not look the way you remember it. A cold feeling spread through Ethan's stomach. What are you talking about? But the old man was already stepping backward into the fog. Within seconds, the darkness swallowed him completely. The forest fell silent again. Ethan stood alone beside the small lantern, staring into the empty trees. He had the strange feeling that he had just spoken to someone who did not belong to the same world he did. And somewhere deep in the Appalachian forest, something ancient had already begun to move. For the rest of the night, Ethan barely slept. He sat beside the fading lantern, replaying the old man's words over and over in his mind. Walk east when the sun rises. The forest remained quiet after that encounter. The strange footsteps and distant figures never appeared again. It was as if whatever had been watching him earlier had simply lost interest. Or perhaps something else had taken control. Eventually, the dark sky above the trees began to fade into a pale gray. Dawn slowly crept into the Appalachian forest. Ethan stood up, stiff from sitting all night. His body ached, and his eyes felt heavy from exhaustion. But he was relieved. Morning meant direction, visibility, a way out. He packed his lantern, checked his bag, and pulled out his compass. The needle pointed steadily now. East. Just like the old man had said, Ethan took a deep breath and began walking. At first, the forest still felt strange. The fog lingered between the trees, and the silence seemed heavier than normal. But after about 30 minutes of walking, the fog began to thin. Sunlight slowly filtered through the branches. Birds started singing again. The forest felt alive. Ethan's tension eased a little. Maybe the old man had simply been another experienced hiker who knew the forest well. Maybe the strange events of the night had just been his mind reacting to stress and fatigue. That explanation felt easier to accept. After nearly an hour of walking, Ethan finally saw something that made his heart lift. A dirt road. He stepped out of the trees and stared at it with relief. The road was narrow and covered with loose gravel, but it was clearly used by vehicles from time to time. "Thank God," Ethan muttered. He recognized the area. His truck was parked somewhere along this road. He began walking quickly along the roadside. Within 10 minutes, he saw it. His old pickup truck, still sitting exactly where he had left it 2 days earlier. Ethan walked up to it and ran his hand along the door. Everything looked normal. Nothing had been touched. He unlocked the door, tossed his backpack onto the passenger seat, and climbed in. For the first time since getting lost, he allowed himself to relax. The engine started immediately. "All right," Ethan said quietly as he pulled onto the road. "Let's go home." The narrow road wound slowly down the mountain, twisting through thick forest and rocky hillsides. Ethan drove carefully, still feeling slightly tired but grateful the ordeal was over. After about 20 minutes, the gravel road connected with the paved highway that led back toward town. Ethan turned onto it and began the familiar drive home. At first, everything seemed normal. The mountains slowly gave way to smaller hills, and eventually the forest opened into farmland and scattered houses. But after a while, Ethan noticed something that made him frown. A gas station appeared along the roadside. He didn't remember it being there. The building looked new. Bright white paint, fresh signs, modern pumps. "That's weird," he murmured. He had driven this road hundreds of times over the years. There had never been a gas station at that spot. Ethan shrugged it off. Maybe construction had happened recently and he just hadn't noticed before. He kept driving. 10 minutes later, he passed another unfamiliar building. A convenience store. New parking lot. New sign. "Okay," Ethan said under his breath. Now he felt a small ripple of confusion. The road itself looked the same. The mountains were still in the distance, but several buildings along the roadside looked different. Newer. Changed. Ethan continued toward town. As the familiar welcome sign appeared ahead, he slowed the truck slightly. "Welcome to Pine Ridge. Population 3,102. Ethan drove into town. At first glance, it looked like the same quiet place he had left 2 days earlier. But the longer he drove, the more uneasy he felt. The old movie theater on Main Street had a new sign. The diner on the corner had been repainted. Even the grocery store parking lot had been expanded. "Did they renovate half the town in 2 days?" Ethan muttered. Something didn't feel right. He continued driving toward his neighborhood. As he turned onto his street, his chest tightened slightly. A few houses looked freshly painted. One house had an entirely new front porch. Another had a car parked outside that he had never seen before. Ethan slowed his truck. The street looked familiar, but also different, like he had been gone longer than he thought. "Maybe I'm just tired," he said to himself. Finally, Ethan reached his house. The small single-story home sat exactly where it always had, surrounded by the same oak trees and wooden fence. Relief washed over him. "See?" he said quietly. "Everything's fine." He parked the truck in the driveway and turned off the engine. For a moment, he simply sat there, enjoying the comfort of being home again. But then he noticed something strange. A different car was parked in the driveway. Ethan frowned. A silver sedan. He didn't own a silver sedan. "Did my sister stop by?" he wondered aloud. He opened the truck door and stepped out. As he walked toward the house, another detail caught his attention. The front porch looked slightly different. a new welcome mat, new flower pots, things he definitely had not placed there. Ethan's uneasiness slowly returned. He walked up the steps and knocked on the door. There was movement inside. Footsteps. The door opened, but the person standing there was not someone Ethan recognized. A middle-aged woman stared at him in confusion. "Yes?" she said cautiously. Ethan blinked. Sorry," he said. "I think you might have the wrong house." The woman frowned. "I live here." Ethan felt his stomach drop slightly. "No, I live here." The woman studied him more carefully. Then something about her expression suddenly changed. Her eyes widened. Her face went pale. She stepped back slowly. "Wait," she whispered. Ethan frowned. "What?" The woman looked at him like she'd just seen a ghost. "Your name," she said nervously. "It's Ethan Walker, isn't it?" A cold chill ran through his body. "Yes," he said slowly. The woman covered her mouth with one hand. "Oh my God." Ethan's heart began to beat faster. "What's going on?" The woman stared at him with disbelief. You disappeared last year." The words hit him like a sudden blow. "What?" The woman shook her head slowly. "Everyone in town knows that story," she said. "They searched the mountains for weeks." Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him. "That's impossible," he said. "I was gone 2 days." The woman looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "No," she whispered. "You've been missing for almost a year." For several seconds, Ethan simply stood on the front porch staring at the woman. A year. The word echoed in his mind like a distant thunderclap. "That's not possible," Ethan said slowly. "I left 2 days ago, Friday morning." The woman's expression was a mixture of confusion and fear. "Sir, people have been talking about you for months." Ethan shook his head. "No, you're mistaken." The woman stepped aside slightly, still keeping a cautious distance from him. "Wait here," she said nervously. "I'm calling someone." Before Ethan could respond, she closed the door halfway and pulled out her phone. Ethan stood on the porch, his mind racing. A year? That didn't make sense. He remembered everything clearly. Buying supplies from Mr. Holloway, driving up the mountain, setting up camp, the stone circle, the fog, the old man in the forest. It had only been 2 nights. At most. The front door opened again. The woman looked at him carefully. "My husband is on his way," she said. "He's with the sheriff's office." Ethan's stomach tightened. "Sheriff?" "You were officially reported missing," she said quietly. Ethan leaned against the porch railing. The world suddenly felt unstable, like the ground beneath him was slowly tilting. "This is crazy," he muttered. About 15 minutes later, a police truck pulled into the driveway. A tall man stepped out wearing a sheriff's jacket. He walked toward Ethan slowly. For a moment, the 2 men simply looked at each other. Then the sheriff's eyes widened. "Holy," the man whispered. "Ethan?" Ethan looked at him. "Do I know you?" The sheriff let out a stunned breath. "It's me, Ryan Carter." Ethan blinked. Ryan Carter had been one of his closest friends growing up. But the man standing in front of him looked older. His hair was shorter. There were deeper lines around his eyes. "What's going on?" Ethan asked. Ryan shook his head slowly, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "You disappeared last March," Ryan said. "We searched those mountains for 3 weeks." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "No, I went camping Friday." Ryan stared at him. "Ethan, today is March again." Ethan's mind went blank. "March what?" "March 12th. Ethan shook his head. No, it was March 9th when I left." Ryan's voice was quiet. "That was last year." The silence between them felt heavy. Ethan felt his breathing become shallow. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen lit up. The date displayed clearly. March 12th. 1 year later. Ethan stared at the screen, unable to move. That's wrong, he whispered. Ryan stepped closer. Where were you? Ethan shook his head slowly. In the mountains. For a year? No, Ethan said quickly. 2 days. Ryan exchanged a look with the woman standing behind him. You never came back, Ryan said. Your truck was found near the trailhead. Ethan's heart skipped. My truck? It was still there when the search teams arrived, Ryan said. You vanished somewhere in the forest. Ethan felt a cold chill run down his spine. But I drove it home today. Ryan frowned. What? I just drove down the mountain, Ethan said. Ryan looked genuinely confused. That truck has been sitting in the evidence lot for 11 months. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. What? Ryan pulled out his phone. After scrolling for a moment, he turned the screen toward Ethan. There was a photo. Ethan's truck, parked in a fenced police lot. A faded tag attached to the windshield. Ethan's hands began to tremble. That's impossible, he whispered. Ryan studied him carefully. Ethan, where exactly were you in the mountains? Ethan swallowed. There was a valley. Ryan's expression changed slightly. What kind of valley? There was a circle of stones, Ethan said quietly. Ryan's face slowly went pale. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he asked one more question. Did you step inside it? Ethan hesitated. Yes. Ryan exhaled slowly. Oh man. Ethan looked at him. What? Ryan rubbed his face with both hands. There are stories about places like that in the Appalachians. Ethan forced a nervous laugh. You mean ghost stories? Ryan shook his head. Not exactly. He lowered his voice slightly. Old mountain legends talk about places where time behaves differently. Ethan felt the memory of the old man's words return. Time does not always move the same way. Ryan continued. People disappear out there sometimes. Ethan stared at him. And? Ryan looked directly into his eyes. Most of them never come back. The weight of that sentence hung in the air. Ethan suddenly felt dizzy. All the strange events began connecting in his mind. The silent valley, the spinning compass, the fog, the figures in the trees, the old man, and his final warning. When you return home, the world may not look the way you remember it. Ethan slowly sank down onto the porch steps. My mom, he whispered. Ryan nodded quietly. She thought you were dead. Ethan closed his eyes. Guilt washed over him like a wave. For 2 days, he had wandered through a strange forest. But for his family, an entire year had passed. A year of waiting. A year of searching. A year of believing they had lost him forever. Ethan opened his eyes again. Can I see her? Ryan nodded. She lives with your sister now. Ethan stood slowly. His legs still felt weak. Ryan placed a hand on his shoulder. You're lucky, man, Ryan said quietly. Ethan looked at him. Ryan's voice was serious. Whatever happened in those mountains, it let you come back. The drive to his sister's house felt longer than any journey Ethan had ever taken. Ryan followed behind him in the sheriff's truck, while Ethan sat silently in the passenger seat of another patrol vehicle. They had insisted on driving him themselves, partly for safety, partly because no one in town quite knew what to make of his return yet. Ethan barely noticed the roads passing by outside the window. His thoughts kept circling the same painful realization. 1 year. While he had wandered through fog and strange silence in the mountains, an entire year had passed in the real world. A year his family believed he was gone forever. The patrol car finally slowed as they entered a quiet residential neighborhood on the other side of town. Ryan parked along the curb and turned to Ethan. You ready? He asked gently. Ethan swallowed. I think so. They walked up the driveway together. The house looked warm and lived in. Lights glowed softly through the windows. A small wind chime hung near the porch, moving gently in the evening breeze. Ryan knocked on the door. A moment later it opened. Ethan's younger sister, Claire, stood there. For a second she simply stared. Her eyes widened. The color drained from her face. "Ethan?" she whispered. Ethan felt his throat tighten. "Hey, Claire?" For a moment she didn't move. Then suddenly she rushed forward and wrapped her arms around him. "You're alive!" she cried. Ethan held her tightly, feeling the weight of that moment. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Claire pulled back slightly, wiping tears from her eyes. "You disappeared," she said. "We searched everywhere." Ethan lowered his head. "I know." Claire looked toward Ryan, who gave her a small nod. Then she spoke softly. "Mom's inside." Ethan's heart pounded as he stepped through the doorway. The house smelled like fresh coffee and old wood. He followed Claire down the hallway. At the end of the living room, an elderly woman sat in a chair near the window. His mother. Her hair looked a little grayer than he remembered. Her shoulders slightly more fragile. Claire spoke gently. "Mom." The old woman turned her head. When her eyes met Ethan's, time seemed to stop. For several seconds she simply stared at him. Then her hands began to tremble. "Ethan?" she whispered. He stepped forward slowly. "Hi, Mom." Tears immediately filled her eyes. She stood up with difficulty and walked toward him. Then she wrapped her arms around him with surprising strength. Ethan felt her shoulders shaking as she cried. "I thought I lost you," she said softly. Ethan closed his eyes. "I'm so sorry." For a long moment they simply held each other. All the guilt Ethan had been carrying finally surfaced. All the phone calls he had ignored. All the dinners he had skipped. All the moments he had believed could wait until later. Later had almost never come. Eventually they sat together in the living room. Ryan quietly excused himself, leaving the family alone. Ethan explained everything he remembered. The camping trip. The strange valley. The stone circle. The night in the fog. The old man in the forest. Claire listened silently. His mother held his hand the entire time. When he finished, the room was quiet. Finally, Claire spoke. "So for you, it really was just 2 days." Ethan nodded slowly. "Yes." His mother squeezed his hand gently. "Sometimes," she said softly, "life gives us strange second chances." Ethan thought about the old man's words in the forest. You crossed a boundary. Where you stepped, time does not always move the same way. For a long time, Ethan had believed he had unlimited time. Time to call his mother. Time to visit family. Time to slow down. But standing there in that quiet living room, he finally understood something that the mountains had forced him to learn. Time was not guaranteed. Not for anyone. The experience in the Appalachian forest had taken 1 year away from his life. But in a strange way, it had also given something back. Perspective. From that day forward, Ethan began living differently. He still worked construction, but he no longer chased overtime every weekend. He visited his mother often. He had dinner with Claire and her family almost every week. Sometimes they sat together on the porch in the evening, watching the sunset over the hills. On quiet nights, Ethan would look toward the distant outline of the Appalachian Mountains. The forest looked peaceful from far away. Beautiful. But he knew better than most people that those mountains held mysteries older than any town. And sometimes, late at night, Ethan would remember the old man's voice in the fog. There are places where time does not move the way humans expect. Ethan never returned to that valley. He never searched for the stone circle again. Some doors, he realized, are not meant to be opened twice. But he carried the lesson with him every day. Because 2 days in the mountains had taught Ethan Walker something that many people spend their entire lives learning. The future can wait. But the people you love should never have to.